It's really wonderful to be with you. So I'm come from a family with very long Christian traditions. I'm privileged about that. And I'm a theologian. I've been concerned about media for a very long time. So I've been working in a Christian University College context, educating journalists, educating Christian communicators, producing resources of various kinds, and trying to learn more, practice double listening, as John Stott talked about, listening to the word and the world. I'm the lesser half of our couple. Margunn is also very much involved with the forum. So we live in the southern part of Norway. I've been living here for a long time, and she's from Stavanger area, which is on the southwest, the oil capital of Norway. We don't have any kids of our own, but we have, I think, 8 or 9 godchildren, which keeps us busy, happy and busy. And we enjoy the privilege of having friends and the local church, very mission-focused church, and the gift of international Christian friendship, like this is. Let me just then share the screen. So the topic I was given was communicating persuasively in a post-Christian world, and with Paul in Athens as a case study. And if you don't remember anything else, I would like you to take away these 2 symbols, because this day, I understand, is focused on engaging with our times as the overall topic. And there are 2 symbols symbolizing the Christian apologetic traditions throughout the ages. The one is the symbol of the open hand, of inviting people to explore the Christian faith. That is, you can see that it's eloquentia, it's the eloquency, it's the rhetorical tradition, the speaking, the oratorical tradition. The other tradition is the closed fist. And remember, it's not the closed fist that knocks down someone. It's the closed fist that says, I'm convinced of this. It's the closed fist being used in the courtroom, laying forth, putting forth your case. And we're going to look at Paul in Athens, and as a key passage about engaging with culture. And of course, this passage is the most popular Bible passage in popular apologetics. So you can hardly come across any kind of lecture or talk or book or whatever, introduction to apologetics, without actually Act 17 being mentioned, Paul in Athens. And I just found this lovely picture. You know, it's somewhat, you know, it lacks color, doesn't it? So why not continue with some color to it and ask, what are the popular misunderstandings that we may come across in terms of the passage? I would like to briefly introduce to you 5 ways of reading the passage, just as a way of introducing the theme here, that does not really pay full tribute to the passage itself. You may have heard the passage referred to as the Mars Hill passage. And you know, the Mars Hill is the Areopagos. That's the little hill in Athens where called after the Mars in Latin, or Ares, the war god. But actually, I think it's highly likely that Paul did not engage on the hill, but rather on the agora, or in the agora itself, in the marketplace. Because, well, I don't have time to go into all the details. I just briefly mention here that the Areopagos Council that met on the hill also met within the court. Secondly, it is not to be understood as a formal legal defense. Rather, the Areopagos Council that Paul was invited to present his case to was kind of had an advisory function or a commissioning function. One of the functions was to commission heralds for unknown gods. So if there was an someone coming into the city and claim to be a herald of an unknown God. They could be given the sort of the imprimatur of that council. Thirdly, Paul's speech is not literally a missionary primer, because he had already engaged in the marketplace before he spoke to them, before he's invited to speak, to address this majestic speech. So in order to understand the whole, we need the whole scene, also Luke's introductory words. And some people have claimed that Paul only philosophized, that he only sort of, that he went off the racks, off the trails this time, and he did not present the gospel as such. I don't think that is at all a credible representation of what Paul did. Neither is it an isolated passage, as we will see. And I think it's helpful to, instead of focusing on the misunderstandings, try to look at what are the promising pathways that we may take to understand the passage, to think about Paul as an authentic and relevant apologist in Athens. And the first element there is that this fits, this way of reading the passage, as Paul as an authentic and relevant apologist, this fits Luke's overall purpose of Luke Acts. You remember Luke wrote 2 books. There was a 2-volume work where the prologue, the preface to Luke's gospel, also functions as an extended preface to the book of Acts. And Luke saying, I wanted you to know, dear Theofilos, how credible the things that you were taught. So the whole question about teaching Theofilos and any other reader, of course, like us today, about the credibility of the gospel over against including any other worldview. Secondly, there is an overall pattern in Acts. We see it partly through other passages, like this corresponds to the passage in Lystra in Acts 14. It also partly corresponds to the passage with Paul before Agrippa towards the end there in Acts 26. But if you look at it beyond that, and you see all the synagogues appearances Paul had, there is a parallel structure in Paul's argument. He starts in the synagogue context with the Old Testament, but outside the synagogue, he starts with the shared experience of being a human being, of creation, and from that perspective, moving to Christ. So it's either from the Old Testament to Christ, Jesus Christ, or it's from creation to Jesus Christ. And we've already said that it fits Luke's picture of Paul in the Agora as a herald of foreign gods. Very fascinating to read about how new research, how new archaeological and historical research actually have uncovered a whole new context behind there that uncovers the sort of the subtext in the text. And then fourthly, it's interesting to look at least 4 passages in Paul's letters. The first one is 1 Corinthians 9. You remember that as the one where Paul talks about being, a Jew to the Jews or a Gentile to the Gentiles, being all things to all men. And of course, this is Paul's principle of mission, principle of contextualization. He wants to be authentic and relevant, whatever the context. And then we have in 1 Thessalonians 1, 9 to 10, which is, interesting enough, written about the same time as Paul was in Athens, and where he talks in very similar terms to his preaching or his communication, his public communication in Acts 17 about turning from idols to the living God and repenting and waiting for the Son who is coming back. Romans 1, of course, talks about God's revealing himself in nature, about God's natural revelation being visible in nature, even though we tend to suppress that. And even 1 Corinthians 2 is fascinating, because there, as John Stott helpfully said, it's not about what Paul, remember Acts 17 is Paul moving there from Acts 17 to Acts 18 to Corinth. And 1 Corinthians 2 is sometimes then read as Paul repenting of what he did in Acts 17. But it's rather Paul is addressing in 1 Corinthians 2. He's addressing the sophistic approach where wisdom for wisdom's sake was the point, not any true insights. So we could, of course, go into this more in depth, but hopefully you see the overall picture here. So let's move to the narrative introduction. And the focus is fascinating. The focus is not on the synagogue in this passage. It's the synagogue context just gets half a verse in this passage, whereas in most other passages, it's a major focus. And we see that the agora is the context and the focus, the marketplace. And of course, as you may know, the marketplace of an ancient city like Athens was the heart of the city. That's where the education took place. That's where the buying and selling, the commercial life took place. That's where the sporting life took place. That's where people met, you know, at least the higher class and the upper middle class. So we see that Paul is walking around, and I actually found, preparing for this forum, I found the free Bible images. And you will see that in the PowerPoint here. A lovely presentation there that you may want to explore if you have time. I think those pictures were the best I've come across in terms of illustrating Paul. There are 16 icons or 16 images illustrating Paul's visit to Athens there. Really, really nice. And in that narrative introduction then, Luke highlights something. He highlights what are the questions to Paul. He highlights what are the objections to Paul. He highlights what are the misunderstandings that Paul's gospel come across, even to the extent that people think that he's talking about two different gods. You know, Jesus and the resurrection. So the resurrection was so important. It was emphasized alongside Jesus and was conceived through their, you know, their framework as a God. And probably, you know, Jesus as a male God and Anastasia as a female God. Fascinating how, and it's a relief, isn't it? Even Paul was misunderstood when he was communicating the gospel. And of course, there were worldview alternatives that were focused on. And in this narrative introduction in Acts 17, and the Stoics and the Epicureans are the two major worldview alternatives that that Luke is focusing on when describing Paul here. So then Paul is invited to address the listener, to address this specific council, the Areopagus Council. And he was probably given maybe 2 days, 1 day, 4 days of preparation before doing that. And then he delivers a speech where he starts by building a bridge, and then he moves on to a challenging and tension. And this passage was actually the focus of my PhD. So I've had the opportunity of looking at this passage more than once. You know, when fascinating to see that some commentators or some people applying this passage only emphasize the points of contact, whereas others only emphasize the points of tension. But I think what we need to keep together is the both and. It's building a bridge, but it's also challenging. And it's oversimplified when I'm saying here that it's starting with one and ending with the other. Already from the beginning, Paul are challenging, and the way through Paul is challenging. And of course, we all have heard about the altar to an unknown God, which was like a bridgehead for Paul in his communication here. And it seems as if that altar was a natural starting point for Paul, because in that altar he could identify a longing for God, an underlying longing. He could also identify an ignorance of who God is. And if that altar was true in admitting ignorance, then all the other altars were then claiming knowledge. So that altar was implicitly a critique of the other altars. And then it's fascinating because there was an old story in Athens about a plague or a very serious illness that happened many years before, and many hundred years before Christ. And according to that story, the Athenians they thought that the gods had hit them with their wrath. So how were they to please the gods? Well, they lit, they had burnt offerings on all different kind of altars. But how were they sure that they had placated, that they had pleased all the gods? There may be a god, an unknown god that was behind this, that they did not think about. So then the story goes that they erected altars to an unknown god to be sure that they also pleased any kind of unknown god. So you see the concept of judgment that is so central at the end of the speech there is actually introduced already in reference to the altar. And then we see Paul goes on and builds an overall presentation here, where he moves from natural theology, what we can perceive through nature is actually a sense of that there is a creator. And if there is an author of life, he has authority over life. And that God has not left himself without revealing who he is. Through Jesus and the resurrection, he has shown his name and his face. And through that, Paul moves towards a challenging of belief and behavior. Then we see in the final concluding section there by Luke, there is a very interesting, the same kind of pattern that we meet everywhere in Acts. There is a dual reaction. Some, are negative, some are positive. And the number of the two groups may vary, but that kind of reaction seemed to be a realistic reaction to expect when you present the gospel. And then there is both scorn, there is interest, and there are, thankfully, some conversions. And there you can see the Lady Damaris there on the left, probably. So maybe just briefly think, is there anything here that was fresh to you? Any surprises there? You may just want to reflect on that very briefly. Maybe just reflect in silence for some seconds there, just to slow down a little bit, to give us some pause for thought there. Okay, in this bird's eye view, let's explore a little bit together. What could be some applications here? What could be some lessons for us to learn in terms of both authentic and relevant communication, both persuasive and gracious communication? And I think one way of looking at this is actually saying that we could have explored all 5 of these. We could have explored the arena Paul entered here. How does that apply to our arena today? And it's fascinating to think about the agora, the marketplace, and the dynamics of that. And for example, that there are clear parallels to the academy. The university context today is one of the parallels. Another parallel will be the media, the mainstream media, and beyond that. And I think any kind of marketplace setting where we cannot presuppose that people share our worldview convictions, but we need to start, so to speak, on an open, shared, common ground platform. The second, we'll come back to that, Paul's attitude. It's fascinating to see how he combines he was very convinced, he was very forceful, but still he was gentle. He was polite. He was courteous. He said, the way addressing the council was in a very polite way. So I think we are learning something about balancing things here. Thirdly, Paul's analysis is also fascinating. The way that I think his reading of the prophets in the Old Testament seemed to have given him a way of interpreting the culture that meant that he saw the culture as a mixture, as something that both indicated longings for God and rejection of God. So there is this combination there that is fascinating. So when engaging with, N.T. Wright, the very famous British theologian, church leader, he talks about that Paul is like a master chess player here. He's like someone who is moving, when a really master chess player comes to a new place, the local chess club may set up, let's say, 10 different tables with local players playing, and then he goes around, with one draw there and one draw there and one draw there. And this is like Paul, okay, one draw with the Stoics, one draw with the Epicureans, one draw with the polytheistic, one draw with the Apologetics Council, then back again to the Stoics and so on. And I love that picture because it gives you a sense of the dynamic. There are many parallel conversations going on at the same time. So Paul's approach then is his starting from the points of contact to the points of tension, not either or, it's both and. And Paul's arguments then, moving from natural theology to ultimate authority, to Jesus and the resurrection. So all these may be things we would like to explore together if we had more time. I would like to focus on two things. One is about this arena, how to communicate biblical truth into our secular and pluralistic post-Christian marketplace of ideas. Well, I think it's important how we envision the arena that we meet people with, on today. Do we envision it as a sacred public square? And I'm here borrowing Os Guinness's expressions, as a sacred public square. That means that we are presupposing a religious authority. And that could be, of course, a Christian religious authority, or in the Muslim world, it will be, another religious authority. Or are we encountering a context where others are presupposing a secular worldview? So a naked public square where we have to, people would presume that we accept an atheistic premise or a secular premise. Or is it rather meeting each other on the civil public square where there is an openness for respecting across, for guarding the marketplace as a place for true pluralism? I think this is worth considering what is our concept of the arena. And then the approach. We need both the way of the open hand and the way of the closed fist, the way of inviting people, exploring the creative open hand and the tough argument. And we need both to defend the Christian faith, to commend it. Why is it true? Why is it beautiful? Why is it good? And we need to translate it, find ways of translating it through the identification of points of contact and points of tension. And I think what I'm trying to get across here is this balancing of a truthful communication that is authentic. At the same time, it's clear in the sense of relevant. And those two words, authentic and relevant, are the key words being used by missiologists when they define contextualization. You know, authentic and relevant. It has to be biblical, but it has to be anchored in our reality as well. And then there's this, we touched on this gracious communication, this polite, respectful attitude. We need to think about that. And then the gracious communication, be polite, respectful, and then, but that is coupled with an engaging communication. So it's not either gracious or engaging, it's both and. And I think the way we communicate will show a lot about who we are, and the way we communicate shows how we value other people. And it seems to me that Paul here struck a balance here. So again, back to the open hand and the closed fist. And just towards the end here of my presentation, 2 quotes from Os Guinness. The closed fist represented the dissuasoria, the negative side of apologetics that used all the higher strength of human reason in defense of truth, mustering all the power of reasons, logic, evidence, and argument. Closed fist apologetics had the task of answering every question, countering every objection, and dismantling false objections to the faith and to knowing God. So it's the decisive, forceful argument. What is the way of the open hand? Well, the open hand represented the persuasoria, the positive side of apologetics that used all the highest strengths of human creativity in the defense of truth, expressing the love and compassion of Jesus and using eloquence, creativity, imagination, humor, and irony. Open hand apologetics had the task of helping to pry open hearts and minds that for 1,000 reasons had long grown resistant to God's great grace, so that it could shine like the sun. That's a beautiful expression there.